Look at your car. Why is your car always so filthy?
If you're looking for a tutorial on how to build model cars, then you've come to the wrong place. I have a great deal of respect for automotive modelers, and it is a genre of the hobby that I am least comfortable with. But if you want to learn how to integrate some traditional armour weathering onto your rally car models, then you've certainly come to the right place. So how did I end up building a Celica from 1989? Well, it's a good question, and it's actually part of a group build. And I saw it as a pretty good opportunity to integrate some of these techniques and try something a little bit different, as well as a little bit familiar as well. I'll move through the build process pretty quickly and concentrate on those weathering techniques. But if you have any questions about anything in this video, please feel free to ask them down below and I'll get back to you personally.
Drivers ready? Go! Car number 12, get going!
Here we go. I start the process by breaking down the parts into groups and paint the elements I can. The guards under the car are first painted in an aluminium colour and then painted in a red acrylic paint. The aluminium will be my chipping colour, but I'll talk more about that later. The underside of the floor is also painted in that aluminium colour. Masking then protects it as the layer of white is applied and the details can then be brush painted. Steering arms and the various componentry were pre-painted and installed, and the bash plate could also be glued in place. A quick and easy upgrade on just about any automotive model is executed by drilling out the end of the exhaust pipe using a micro drill. Whilst it's not perfect, it certainly better represents that area of the pipe. The vinyl tyres slot over the wheels and then sit in place. However, I will be able to remove them when it comes time to paint because they're only held in place with a poly cap. The internal tub is painted white and the door panels are masked and sprayed in a black colour. Detail is negligible here and the position will be hard to see once the model has been built, but I couldn't help but add some highlighting using a lighter tone of grey. Highlighting like this helps move the parts away from looking like a toy and adds some natural volume to those shapes. The roll cage is assembled and thin slithers of masking tape are used to exaggerate that detail around the moulded foam. Again, this will be hard to see, but I wanted to have a bit of fun while I was making this thing. The detail around the dash is enhanced with the dial decals set in place. And once set, I can't help myself but to add similar highlights that I used on those door panels and also integrate them over the seats. These elements will be the most visible through the windows, so it's worth the effort and should make a difference once in place and weathered. I'd ordered an aftermarket harness set that unfortunately was lost in transit, and I really couldn't hold this build back anymore for something that would be hard to see on the finished build anyway. So I carefully cut the harness decals out, paper and all, and superglued them into the seats. My hope was the paper would give the straps some weight and some thickness. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for what I'd planned. Now the fun part begins, and that's the weathering of those internal sections. Now I decided to exaggerate a lot of what I'm about to show you for the sake of this demonstration. However, it's always a good idea to follow reference in order to get a realistic looking outcome. In 2007, I was lucky enough to be part of the variety bash through the Australian outback. For those of you who don't know, the bash raises money for sick kids, and I'm proud to say our team raised $25,000 back then. It's one of my most memorable achievements and experiences without question, but I digress. But I tell you this because from experience, I can tell you the car was filthy inside and out, so I wanted to make sure my Celica followed suit. Dry pigments are a coloured, chalky powder of sorts, and are a great way to create a gritty, dirty build-up with your weathering. They are messy as heck, but create effects that are very difficult to achieve any other way. I'm using two colours and ferrying that powder around into crevices and corners, and once satisfied I used an earth-toned enamel paint thinned with a white spirit to migrate through that pigment powder. The pigment won't stick by itself, so the enamel paint binds it and will allow it to adhere to the model. And once dry, I'm able to modify that coverage using a makeup sponge. This technique will be repeated for the cabin, but I first mapped out the dusty areas using a Tamiya flat earth. Now this paint is thinned to around 70% thinner to paint and will help feather and blend the look of the dust in these areas. I can then go back with those earth enamel effects and apply a wash around the details to simulate dust buildup. The effect is most obvious around the dash and should look great through the front windscreen. As you can see, because I'd painted my base layers in lacquers, I'm able to remove and modify my earth effects because they are enamels and the lacquers will not be affected by that white spirit. I hope that makes sense. I have made a video about all the different paint types, so if that detail confused you, I'd encourage you to check it out before we go too much further. The highlights on the dash are working with that dusted layer and the earth tone wash perfectly to create that volume, that weathered look that a dash might get through the Australian outback.
G'day, g'day.
The effects, after drying for around 24 hours, are all then sealed in place using a matte varnish. The body was then primed in a white, and unfortunately I was cutting corners again, and I was planning on trying to use this white primer as my base coat. Unfortunately, after hours of masking and spraying in that black trim, the masking tape dropped just about all of its glue over the model. I tried everything I could to get it off, but there was no getting around the fact I would have to strip it and start again, so a generous coating of oven cleaner and a cling wrap swaddle, and a few hours later I was back in business. This time, however, the shell received a couple of coats of Tamiya white straight from the Rattlecan, and I can tell you the tape was working fine over this surface. It just didn't like the primer for some reason, so note to self, stop cutting corners.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut corners.
Time for the decals, and I knew I was going to have a few dramas with the sheet that had really bad crazing on the surface, and some of the clear sections had a slight yellow tinge to them. On the upside though, the shapes of those red sections were surprisingly precise and they fit really well, but the downside is they literally got hairline cracks through them when I was trying to conform them, even just slightly. Given my time again, and if this was anything other than pretty much a participation model for me, and a good opportunity to play with some weathering techniques, I probably would have masked and sprayed these red elements in. The fine black keyline would have been a little tricky to hold though, but issues around the roof would have been completely avoided. I had been using a decal softener that helps the decals relax through recesses and curves, and it did work okay through some sections, but in most cases the decals could be helped along by trimming them in through those panel lines. Once trimmed, the section is helped settle with the tip of a cotton bud and some steady pressure across those parts. But I needed to address that bunching and splitting of that roof decal, so a soft steel wool was first used to flatten any high points, and then the closest match red I had could be used to blow in some of those issues. Trying to fit that decal around the rear of the car was honestly a lost cause. So whilst painting the red on the roof patches, I took the opportunity to paint that rear bumper section as well, and I'm looking to integrate it in with the red from the decals on the side of the vehicle. Again, I'm trying to be mindful of the end goal with this, and it's all about the weathering. So any inconsistencies in this area should be pretty hard to detect with what I have in mind. The shell is then sealed in a UV gloss varnish straight from the Rattlecan. and then an all over satin varnish from VMS. Now I do that Rattlecan gloss because it is so robust and I know it will seal everything in place. It's my insurance policy of sorts. I go over that in the satin, which is an acrylic product. And I'm doing this because the weathering stages I have planned will be easier to execute on a satin finish. A high gloss finish tends to repel the enamel effects that I'll be applying in a minute, whereas the satin will tend to hold it better. Weathering begins with a reserved application of Tamiya black panel liner. This is an oil-based product and it comes straight out of the bottle in a heavily thinned consistency. This means it tends to migrate through the panel lines and recesses of the model, which in turn will create shadow lines and give depth to those details. It is always inevitable, however, that some cleanup will be required where the wash hasn't stayed through the recesses, but that is a simple process and is done with the tip of a cotton bud moistened with white spirit, and by gently moving it across the part I can remove any unwanted wash and leave myself with a tight, clean panel line. The chrome inserts for the lights can now be glued in place, and the clear parts are then glued to them using a PVA glue so as not to potentially fog them using a modelling cement. The clear parts for the cabin were also masked and painted and glued in place, and things were starting to come together now. I can now finish off the underside of the vehicle by carefully scuffing those bash plates with a sanding sponge. And you might recall I'd painted the plate aluminium initially and then layered the red. And a light sand is revealing that aluminium colour, offering some interesting pops of brightness. It does take a delicate touch, but go by feel and you should be okay. Finally, the two halves can come together and I can set the foundations of my weathering with a misted application of flat earth. I work this through the underside but also along the lower edges of the model, and I look to integrate those tones on the wheels as well. Now, vinyl tyres do not like enamel based products on them, so using the paint to dust them will help avoid having to use enamels for this purpose. Interesting effects can also be created by simply scrubbing at them with your finger. I then move to a buff to add a secondary layer to that dusting, and this time I'm covering a smaller area than I did with the flat earth, and building your dust layers up like this creates a more visually pleasing and realistic result. You may also notice I'd made a paper mask for the windscreen, so by misting the dust over the clears, I'll also be able to create the look the wipers might leave after use. And now again to the fun part of this build, and the part that I would hope would add most value to the true automotive modelers. As I mentioned, I wanted to make this car look nice and grubby after a grueling leg of an Australian rally, and I begin the process by mixing up a pigment paste using a plain, coarse pigment powder with a binding agent, and then to create the colours I can add some enamel colours from the VMS Pigment Jockey range. I need this paint to have some volume, and it was looking a little runny, so I'm able to add even more pigment to the mix to bulk it up. I can then load a brush with the paste and begin flicking it across the bottom of the model. I'm doing this prior to fitting the wheels because I'm wanting to ensure I had a good build up of those mud effects through the wheel wells. I can also use the airbrush to blast air across the tip of the brush to create some random splattering effects. Different brushes and different thicknesses of pigment mix will give you different effects and results, so I would encourage you to have some fun with this process and just let it evolve. And there's nothing stopping you from applying multiple layers of these pigment pastes at this stage as well. I'm trying to think about how the dirt and mud might move off the wheels and fall on the vehicle, and I'm working my way around the model with that in mind. I integrate the effects over the wheels before I fit them as well, and any unwanted pigment is easily removed with a brush and white spirit. Any overscaled dots or odd looking deposits are easily fixed with the white spirit again, as that white spirit is reactivating that pigment mix and is allowing me to modify and remove it. A few final touch-ups and the aerial glued in place would see my venture into the world of rally cars officially complete. Isn't it interesting how we generally find ourselves sticking to one genre of modelling, and the thought of trying something different rarely enters the conversation? Of course, we always have the subjects and the scales we love to work on, but it's often when we stray out of our comfort zones when we find out just how much we have to learn in this hobby. The thought of painting and polishing a high gloss finish on a car model scares the pants off me, so I was never going to take that angle with this car. Maybe that is a comfort zone I need to push at some point, but for today I'll take the win with at least getting this one built and ready for the display table. But how about you guys? What's the one model that pushed you out of your comfort zone? I'd love to know, so let me know in the comments down below. I never claimed to be an authority on car modelling, and this is miles from perfect. So take that side of automotive modelling for what it's worth, and there are plenty of tutorials from guys who actually know what they're doing out there. Today's video was all about using some traditional armour techniques on an automotive subject, so I hope today gave you some ideas that you might be able to use with your own modelling. And please give us a like if you've learned something new today, or consider subscribing, it really helps me out a lot. Or if you really want to help this channel grow, you could always connect with us over on the Patreon page. Every member of that community is valued, so I really hope to see you there. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
Your car looks crap.
Yeah, but look how it blends in with the environment. Prince Charles would love this.